The winter storm was relentless, hammering my remote cabin with icy winds that howled like a living thing. Outside, the snow piled higher with each passing hour, the temperature plummeting to a bone-chilling 40-degree Hansa. Even for Montana's harsh wilderness, this was extreme. My small wooden cabin, weathered by years of solitude, stood as the only barrier between me and nature's fury. I sat by the crackling fire, the orange glow dancing on the walls, casting shadows over the photographs that lined them. They were reminders of a different life, one spent as a wildlife photographer capturing the beauty and power of nature. But that was years ago. Now, my days were simple. Chop wood, check traps, survive. That night, I was lost in thought, sipping a cup of tea, when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but the sound came again, low and rhythmic, almost like a knock. I set my mug down, my heart quickening. Living out here alone, every unfamiliar noise was cause for caution. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the door, each creak of the wooden floorboards amplifying my unease. When I opened the door just a crack, the freezing wind hit me like a wall, stinging my face and stealing my breath. But the cold wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. It was what I saw. There, on my snow-covered porch, stood a massive bear. Her fur was crusted with ice, and her eyes, dark and deep, locked onto mine. Behind her, two tiny cubs huddled together, their small bodies trembling violently in the brutal cold. The mother bear swayed slightly, as though barely able to keep herself standing. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to shut the door. A bear this close to a human was dangerous enough, but in her condition, with cubs to protect, she was potentially lethal. Yet something about her stopped me. She wasn't growling or charging. Instead, she lowered her massive head and let out a sound I had never heard before, a low, mournful moan that cut through the storm and pierced straight to my core. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She pawed at the snow near the threshold, nudging one of the cubs forward before collapsing to her knees. The cub stumbled weakly, falling into the drift. Even from where I stood, I could see the ice forming on their fur, the shivering that was growing weaker with each second. I stood there, clutching the doorframe, torn between fear and a gnawing sense of responsibility. Everything I knew about survival told me to close the door, to let nature take its course. But then the mother bear lifted her head again, her eyes locking onto mine. There was no aggression in her gaze, no wildness, only desperation. I stepped back, my breath visible in the freezing air. For a moment, I considered pretending I hadn't seen them. It wasn't my responsibility, was it? But then I looked again. One of the cubs had stopped moving entirely, its tiny body almost buried in the snow. The mother let out another mournful sound, nudging the lifeless cub with her nose. In that moment I knew I couldn't just stand there and watch them die. Something deep inside me stirred, pushing past the fear, the logic, and the rules I had lived by for years. I didn't know how or if this would work, but I had to try. With shaking hands, I pulled the door open wider, the warmth from inside spilling out into the frozen night. The storm howled louder, as though protesting my decision, but I didn't care. "Come on," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible over the wind. The mother bear looked at me, her body trembling with exhaustion. Slowly, she nudged her cubs forward, her movements careful, as though testing whether she could trust me. And just like that, the line between man and beast blurred, and an extraordinary journey began. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as the reality of what I had just done hit me like a freight train. I had invited a bear and her cubs into my world, something every survival guide warned against. The potential for disaster was immense, yet the thought of those cubs freezing to death outside had been unbearable. The mother bear and her 2 surviving cubs now sat in the entryway, just inside the door. They were huddled together, the cubs pressing tightly against their mother's massive body. Frost clung to their fur, and their tiny frames trembled with the residual cold. The mother's eyes followed my every move, her expression wary but not aggressive. I needed to act fast. There was no way I could let them stay in the main part of the cabin, it was too risky. But the small storage room attached to the cabin might work. It was insulated, and with the old space heater and some blankets, I could make it warm enough. Moving cautiously, I backed away, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The mother bear tensed slightly but didn't move. "It's okay," I murmured, as if speaking to a frightened animal was enough to bridge the gap between our worlds. In the storage room, I worked quickly. I plugged in the heater and tested it, relieved to hear it hum to life. I cleared away the scattered tools and dust-covered boxes, spreading out thick blankets on the floor. It wasn't perfect, but it would be enough to keep them alive. When I returned to the entryway, the mother bear was still watching me, her massive form blocking the cubs from view. I opened the door to the storage room, stepping aside to show her the space. "This is for you," I said softly, my voice trembling. She didn't move at first, her dark eyes studying me intently. Then, as if she understood, she nudged one of her cubs forward. The little one stumbled across the floor, its tiny legs unsteady before collapsing onto the blankets. The second cub followed, wobbling but determined. Finally, the mother bear moved. She rose slowly, her sheer size filling the small space, and carefully stepped into the storage room. I stayed rooted in place, holding my breath as she circled the cubs and settled down around them, her body wrapping protectively around her babies. I backed out of the room, closing the door softly behind me. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins. I had no idea if what I'd done was smart or suicidal. The storm still raged outside, and now I was sharing my cabin with a family of bears. Throughout the night, I checked on them from a crack in the door. Each time, the mother bear lifted her head to look at me, her eyes filled with exhaustion but no hostility. The cubs, slowly warming in the blankets, began to stir. Their faint whimpers, once desperate, turned into soft, rhythmic breathing. The storm battered the cabin walls, shaking the windows and howling through the trees. Yet inside, a fragile peace settled over the unlikely scene. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, replaying the events of the evening in my mind. Every instinct I'd ever relied on told me I'd made a mistake. Wild animals were unpredictable, especially in desperate situations. But there was no turning back now. As the hours passed, I realized something had shifted. The fear that had gripped me earlier was beginning to fade, replaced by a strange sense of connection. By dawn, the storm had subsided, leaving the forest blanketed in snow. I peeked into the storage room one last time, my breath catching as I saw the mother bear curled protectively around her cubs. One of the little ones opened its eyes briefly, looking at me with a curiosity that mirrored my own. I had no idea what would happen next, but in that moment I knew one thing for certain. This encounter had already changed me. The rules I had lived by in the wilderness were starting to feel less like absolutes and more like guidelines, open to interpretation when life and compassion hung in the balance. As the morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, the storm outside had calmed, leaving behind a heavy stillness. I checked the storage room again. The mother bear was awake, her massive form curled around the 2 cubs, who now moved faintly under the warmth of the blankets. The sight filled me with relief, but also a gnawing sense of unease. Their immediate danger was over, but a new set of challenges loomed. I knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. Bears didn't belong in human spaces, and I didn't belong in theirs. Yet, for the moment, we were bound together by circumstance. I stepped quietly into the room, placing a shallow bowl of water on the floor. The mother bear raised her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine. For a moment I froze, unsure of how she might react. But instead of growling or retreating, she cautiously sniffed the air, then lowered her head to drink. The cubs stirred weakly, one lifting its tiny paw to rest against her side. This was a temporary truce, I reminded myself. Still, watching her drink, I couldn't shake the feeling that she understood I was trying to help. Later that afternoon, I decided to clear the snow from around the cabin. I needed to create a path to the nearby woodpile and ensure the roof wasn't weighed down too heavily. Grabbing my shovel, I stepped outside into the frigid air, my breath forming clouds as I worked. That's when I noticed it. Deep, deliberate paw prints in the snow. They were too large to belong to the mother bear, and their spacing suggested a larger, heavier animal. My stomach twisted as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They circled the cabin, leading back into the dense forest. A male bear. The realization hit me hard. Male bears were notorious for targeting cubs, even their own. It was likely the reason the mother bear had fled her den in the first place. She wasn't just running from the cold, she was running from a predator. I returned to the cabin, my chest tight with anxiety. Peeking into the storage room, I saw the mother bear still curled around her cubs, her breathing steady. She had no idea the danger was so close, or maybe she did. Her instincts had driven her here, to this unlikely sanctuary. As the day wore on, I kept a vigilant eye on the tree line. The forest was quiet, unnervingly so, as though holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that the male bear was still nearby, watching, waiting for an opportunity. That night, as darkness fell, I found myself unable to sleep. Every sound outside made my heart race. Every shadow cast by the moonlight seemed like a lurking figure. I checked the storage room again, finding the mother bear alert, her ears twitching at the faintest noise. She was on edge, too. Around midnight I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that echoed through the still night. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, stepping cautiously toward the window. Peering outside, I saw a massive shape moving through the snow. The male bear had returned. It prowled at the edge of the clearing, its dark silhouette illuminated by the faint light of the moon. The animal sniffed the air, its massive head swinging side to side as it picked up the scent of the mother bear and her cubs. Inside the storage room, the mother bear let out a deep, guttural growl, her body rising protectively over her cubs. I had never seen her move so quickly, her exhaustion replaced by raw determination. I knew I couldn't let this escalate. If the male got any closer, there would be no stopping the fight that would follow, and no guarantee of survival for the cubs or even the mother herself. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. The male bear froze, its head snapping toward me. For a moment we locked eyes, man and beast, each sizing the other up. I shouted, waving my arms, trying to make myself look as large and threatening as possible. "Get out of here!" My voice cracked but carried across the clearing. The male bear growled low, taking a step forward. My heart pounded as I raised my rifle, not to shoot, but to fire a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed like a crack of thunder, startling the bear. It hesitated, snarling, before finally retreating back into the forest. Inside the cabin, the mother bear watched me closely as I re-entered, her eyes filled with a strange mix of wariness and understanding. We had faced the same threat, fought for the same cause, and in that moment I realized we were no longer just strangers bound by circumstance. We were allies in survival. The night stretched on in tense silence after the male bear retreated into the forest. My heart was still pounding from the encounter, and the cold air clinging to me didn't help. I locked the cabin door, though I knew it was little more than a formality against an animal of that size. Peeking into the storage room, I found the mother bear still on high alert, her ears twitching at every faint sound outside. She had risen to her full height, shielding the cubs with her massive frame. Her breaths were steady but deep, and her dark eyes flicked toward me as I stood in the doorway. "I don't think he's gone for good," I muttered, though the words were more to myself. The male bear's boldness worried me. He had come too close and seemed intent on following the scent of the mother and her cubs. I couldn't let my guard down. The storm had passed, and with it, the muffling effect of the wind and snow. Now, every crunch, rustle, and snap from the forest outside echoed loudly, keeping me on edge. Sleep was impossible. I took my rifle and sat near the window, my eyes scanning the clearing for movement. Hours later, just before dawn, I saw it. The massive silhouette of the male bear emerging from the tree line again. My chest tightened as the enormous predator moved with deliberate purpose, its nose low to the ground, following a trail invisible to me. It was closer this time, more confident. I hurried to the storage room. The mother bear was already growling, a deep, resonant sound that sent shivers down my spine. Her instincts told her what I had just seen. Danger was near. She moved to the door, standing between it and her cubs, her body radiating both strength and exhaustion. I had to act quickly. If the male reached the cabin, there would be no way to stop a confrontation. The storage room wasn't fortified, and the cubs were too weak to run. My options were limited, but one thing was clear. I needed to scare him off before he got any closer. Grabbing my flashlight and rifle, I stepped outside into the freezing air, my breath forming clouds in the stillness. The male bear stopped, its head snapping up to focus on me. It growled low, the sound rumbling like distant thunder. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice sharp and loud. I waved my arms, trying to make myself look larger, more threatening. The bear hesitated, its dark eyes narrowing as it studied me. Then the mother bear surprised me. From inside the storage room, her growls grew louder, more commanding. She stepped into the doorway, her powerful frame filling the small space. Her cubs peeked out from behind her, their tiny forms dwarfed by her size. She let out a roar, long and deep, that seemed to shake the very air around us. The male bear froze, clearly startled by the mother's sudden show of strength. For a moment, the two stared each other down, and I held my breath, unsure of what would happen next. Deciding to press my advantage, I raised the rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the clearing, and the male bear flinched. After a moment of indecision, it let out a frustrated growl and retreated back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows once more. I stood there, my hands trembling, as the tension finally began to fade. When I turned back to the storage room, the mother bear was still watching the clearing, her body taut and ready. After several long seconds, she turned to look at me. Her gaze was softer now, less wary. She let out a quiet huff, something that almost sounded like relief, before returning to her cubs. I watched as she nuzzled them gently, her massive paws pulling them close as they settled back into the blankets. I exhaled deeply, leaning against the doorframe. The danger wasn't completely gone. I knew the male bear might return, but for now, we had won. In that moment, the mother bear's actions struck me. Despite her exhaustion and fear, she had fought to protect her cubs with everything she had, and in some strange way, I had fought alongside her. This unlikely alliance between man and beast was fragile, built on mutual necessity, but it felt profound. I realized then that we weren't just surviving. We were working together in a way I never thought possible. The forest was quiet again, the male bear gone, but the tension in the air lingered. I stayed by the window for hours, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Every snap of a branch or rustle of wind put me on edge. I knew the grizzly could return at any moment, but for now, the mother bear and her cubs were safe. As the morning sun crept higher, I checked on the bears in the storage room. The mother bear was lying with her cubs nestled close, their small bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. One of the cubs had grown curious, its tiny eyes peeking out from beneath the blankets as I entered. The mother watched me cautiously but didn't growl or move to shield them. It struck me how much had changed since that first desperate knock at my door. What started as fear and uncertainty had transformed into an unspoken understanding between us. We were no longer strangers, but allies navigating the dangers of the wilderness together. The day passed quietly. I stayed busy shoveling snow, restocking the woodpile, and securing the cabin, all while keeping one eye on the forest. The mother bear seemed more relaxed now, occasionally shifting her position to let the cubs stretch and play in the warmth of the storage room. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the unease I had been pushing down returned. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath before something happened. And then, as the last rays of light disappeared, I heard it, a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't coming from the storage room, but from outside. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, stepping cautiously onto the porch. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I ignored it, focusing instead on the tree line. My flashlight's beam cut through the shadows, and then I saw it. The male bear, larger and more menacing than before, stepping into the clearing. The grizzly had returned, and this time it wasn't hesitating. Its movements were deliberate, its eyes locked on the cabin. My heart pounded as I raised the rifle, shouting to scare it off, "Go, get out of here!" The bear didn't stop. It growled, the sound deep and resonant, vibrating through the air. I fired a warning shot into the sky, the crack echoing like thunder, but the bear merely flinched before continuing forward. Inside the storage room, the mother bear let out a roar, her body pressing protectively over her cubs. She was ready to fight despite her exhaustion, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was going to end in violence if I didn't intervene. I took a step forward, my boots crunching in the snow, and shouted again. The male bear paused, its ears flicking toward me. For a moment, it seemed to reconsider, but then it let out a roar of its own, louder and angrier, before charging. Time slowed as the massive grizzly barreled toward me. My finger hovered over the rifle trigger, knowing I might have to take the shot. But before I could act, the mother bear erupted from the storage room. She charged toward the male bear with a ferocity I had never seen, her roar cutting through the clearing like a battle cry. The cubs cried out from inside, their high-pitched calls adding urgency to her attack. The two bears collided in the snow, their massive bodies slamming together with a force that seemed to shake the ground. The male swiped at her, his claws catching her shoulder, but she didn't back down. She roared again, pushing him back with sheer determination. I couldn't stand by and watch. With shaking hands, I fired another shot into the air, then shouted as loudly as I could. The male bear turned his head briefly, distracted, and the mother used the opportunity to lunge at him, forcing him to retreat a few steps. Finally, with one last growl, the grizzly backed away. He hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the mother bear, before retreating into the forest. I stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps as the adrenaline coursed through me. The mother bear turned back toward the cabin, her shoulder bleeding but her posture strong. She didn't pause to rest, instead hurrying back to her cubs, who squealed with relief as she re-entered the storage room. I followed, setting the rifle down and quietly closing the door. She curled around her cubs, her body trembling slightly from exertion. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw something I hadn't expected: trust. In that moment, I realized that survival wasn't just about strength or instinct. It was about connections, even the most improbable ones, forged in the face of adversity. The storm may have passed, but this experience had left its mark on both of us. We had fought together, and somehow that made all the difference. The forest fell silent once more as the male bear disappeared into the shadows. I stood outside, rifle still in hand, my breath fogging in the freezing air. Inside the storage room, the mother bear had returned to her cubs, her powerful frame trembling slightly from the exertion of the fight. I stepped back into the cabin, closing the door firmly behind me. The weight of what had just happened hit me like a wave. We had survived, not through luck alone, but because of an unspoken alliance between me and the mother bear. Peeking into the storage room, I saw her gently licking her cubs, checking them as if to reassure herself they were safe. Her shoulder bled from the swipe of the male's claws, but she showed no sign of weakness. Her focus was entirely on her cubs, who squealed softly as they nestled against her. I quietly left a bowl of water and a small piece of food near the door. She watched me, her eyes calm, her growls subdued. It was the closest thing to trust I had ever seen in an animal. As dawn broke, the storm's remnants began to melt under the pale sun. It was time to prepare for their departure. The next morning, the mother bear and her cubs stirred as the first rays of sunlight broke through the frost-covered windows. The storm was gone, leaving the forest quiet and still, the snow glistening under the pale light. It was time for them to leave. I stood by the door as the mother bear nudged her cubs forward. The little ones stumbled, their steps unsteady but determined, as they followed her to the threshold. She paused there, her massive frame silhouetted against the bright snow, and turned to look at me one last time. Her dark eyes held mine, filled with an understanding I couldn't explain. She huffed softly, almost like a farewell, before stepping into the clearing with her cubs close behind. They lingered for a moment, the cubs tumbling playfully in the snow, and then vanished into the trees. I watched them go, my chest tight with emotion. They were gone, but their presence lingered, a reminder of the fragile, unexpected connections we share with nature. As I stood there, I whispered, "Good luck out there," knowing their survival was now in their own paws. This experience would stay with me forever, a testament to resilience, trust, and the bond that can form between man and the wild.